Very warm welcome to the Northwest region, everybody. My name's Lee Marsh. I'm the current chairman of the branch. So a very warm welcome to you, and also a very warm welcome to Lauren Lee, who's going to be presenting for us this evening. So Lauren is the deputy manager at Assurity Consulting, providing commercial and technical support to a team of consultants, as well as day-to-day managerial support for the consultancy services manager, and she's also the service leader for the fire safety management service, and positioned as the main point of contact for the business and developing, implementing and reviewing policies, procedures and report templates in line with legislative updates and changes. And she's also instrumental in the primary authority partnership held with, I'm sure it's Herefordshire and the Isle of Wight Fire Rescue Service, and has been tackling and providing briefings for the senior management on the new fire legislation. So a very warm welcome to you, Lauren. A couple of housekeeping just before I hand over to Lauren. We are looking for some new committee members for specific roles. So we're looking for 2 social media champions. So if any of you are happy with kind of posting on LinkedIn and coordinating some of the advertisement for events like this evening, then do please contact the IIRSM and they will pass on your details. And the other one is an events coordinator, and last of all, a vice chairman. So if anybody does fancy becoming one of the vice chairman for a region, then I would really appreciate hearing from you. And again, if you contact the IIRSM membership branch membership office, then they will be able to pass on information to me. So with that, as I say, a very warm welcome, and Lauren, a very warm welcome to you as well.
Thank you, Lee, and thanks, Julie, and thanks for everyone for having me on this evening. So as previously mentioned, I'm a consultancy services deputy manager at Assurity Consulting. Been here around 8 years now, coming up this year, and I also head up our fire safety services within the business. So the fact that you're here attending this webinar means you are already aware of the mountain of changes that have occurred recently in the fire industry. So my goal this evening is to kind of give you a brief overview of the Fire Safety Act, the Building Safety Act, Fire Safety England regulations, what we expect to happen in time to come, and hopefully give you a bit of an insight into what you should be doing already, and also how you can prepare for the future. Unfortunately, it will be rather brief, as I can only touch on so much in my allocated time slot today. But without further ado, I do want to cover the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order. Now, the majority of you either heard about it or should be well versed in what it is. I am going to touch on it briefly because it is fundamental in understanding the new legislation that's come in. So the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order, or RRFSO to shorten it, was enacted in 2005 but came into force in October 2006. It replaced the majority of fire safety legislation that was in place and basically brought everything under one simple order. What it did do is it wrote down in law that any person who has some control of a premises must take reasonable steps to reduce the risk from fire and make sure people can escape that building if a fire occurs. Now, this is why it's fundamental to understand this piece of legislation, because the new legislation that's come in basically extends the requirements of this legislation. So the RRFSO had 5 parts, and within those parts had a number of articles, is what they call them. So I'm not going to go through all of them, don't worry, but part 2 is the typical stuff that we're used to seeing when we think of managing fire safety within a building. So I think we've all heard of the term responsible person. What does it mean under legislation, so in the eyes of the law? So a responsible person, if in relation to a workplace, is the employer. If the workplace is under their control. If it's not a workplace, then in relation to any premises that you have control of. So you could have multiple responsible persons within one single commercial building because you have multiple tenants. So you'll have a responsible person for each of those tenants, and then you'll have a responsible person who manages the communal areas of the building and the structural aspects of the building. So as I said, part 2 kind of includes all the detail of our day-to-day lives that fire safety has an impact on. So it covers Article 8 to 24. 24 I will come on to a bit later in this presentation. But Articles 8 to 23 essentially cover all of these bullet points. So Article 9 is to complete a risk assessment. We're all aware that we have a legal duty to carry out a fire risk assessment. We must provide fire safety training, so that's Article 21. Must produce an emergency plan and display that within our building. So we're thinking of not only our staff, but our visitors and contractors that come into the building. Conduct fire evacuation drills. That is a form of training as well. Consulting staff, but also the local fire and rescue service, carry out regular fire safety inspections of our properties, so ensuring that escape routes are clear, they're not obstructed, fire doors aren't being propped open, there are limited electrical hazards and other fire hazards, no smoking within the building, ensuring that our fire detection systems and our firefighting systems are well maintained. So our fire extinguishers, sprinkler systems, emergency lighting, lifts, gas installations. So all of these duties fall under the responsible person in Part 2 of the RFSO between Articles 8 and 23. So moving on to enforcement, this is part 3 of the RFSO. Hopefully none of you have had any of these issued to you. If you have, then hopefully you've learned from them. But there are a number of improvement notices that are issued. So the enforcing authority is typically the Fire and Rescue Service. And they may issue a number of notices when they come and inspect your premises. So they could issue you an alterations notice. So if they feel something needs amending or changing. I think in the past, we've seen a member of the fire authority turn up and they say, oh, I don't like that fire door over there. You should move your fire door over there instead. And then someone comes to visit a year later and they say, oh no, I don't like your fire door there, you should put it back to where it was. Enforcement notices are those that it's almost just an improvement notice. And then a prohibition notice, that means you have to stop whatever you're doing. So that is, you cannot occupy the premises, the property, or you cannot continue with a certain activity that you are partaking in because they deem that there is a serious risk to life from fire. So real quick whistle-stop tour throughout the RFSO, but it all will make sense because we come on to the Fire Safety Act. Now, this occurred due to Dame Judith Hackett carrying out a review of all fire safety legislation in place following the Grenfell Tower tragedy back in 2017. So she delivered an independent review of building regulations and fire safety between 2017 and 2018. Now the focus was on multi-occupied high-rise residential buildings because fire safety legislation was minimal, if not non-existent, in comparison to commercial workplaces, where typically the RFSO only applied. So off the back of her review came the Fire Safety Act. This reached royal assent in April 2021, and then it was enacted in May 2022 in England and October 2021 in Wales. So, as I said, the IIRSM previously only focused on commercial property. So hence why this legislation does not extend to Northern Ireland or Scotland, because they have their own fire safety legislation. But again, I'll come on to that a little bit more later in this presentation. So what does the Fire Safety Act do? It essentially clarifies the scope or extends the requirements of the IIRSM to make it clear that a responsible person or the duty holder for multi-occupied residential buildings now must manage and reduce fire risks. So essentially, if a building contains 2 or more sets of domestic premises or residential dwellings, the IIRSM now extends to the building structure and external walls. So that may be your doors, windows, balconies, anything attached to the exterior of the wall. So even solar panels, plant equipment, condenser units, as well as the common parts within the building and the doors between the residential units and the common parts. So any property that has 2 or more residential units within it. This means that the Fire Safety Act is now not only focused on the 4,000 high-rise residential buildings that we have across the nation, but could be as many as 1.7 million properties that fall under the catchment of this change. So even if we think of boarding houses and schools, they have 2 or more residential units with them. A typical building in London, up north, across the nation, that has commercial units within the middle, retail down on the ground floor, may have a couple of flats at the top. Now falls under the catchment of this legislation. So if we remember back, Article 9 of the IIRSM states that we must risk assess. The risk assessment now needs to capture these areas. And that's essentially it for the Fire Safety Act. It's quite simple, but it has a huge impact across the industry. I also wanted to draw your attention to this new PAS 9980 standard. This came into effect in January 2022, and it focuses on assessments called fire risk appraisals for external walls. Really just rolls off the tongue. This isn't designed for buildings under construction. That's where the Building Safety Act comes in later. And it's also not to be used to put blame for historical building works either. So this standard is the methodology and process to essentially analyse the risk of external fire spread. So we're looking at cladding, etc. It was part of the government's aim for a common sense approach to external wall reviews. I think we found after the Grenfell Tower tragedy, there was a huge influx in demand for external wall surveys. Everyone was asking for surveys for cladding. Did they have cladding? Was it flammable cladding? Was it the same as Grenfell? We just don't have the resource in the country to carry out these surveys. I think we've got approximately 300 fire engineers who are competent in delivering these. So it's just not feasible. So bringing in this PAS standard enabled for a common sense approach. It's for the fire risk assessor to look at. So if you have a building that falls into the scope of the Fire Safety Act, your fire risk assessor should be looking at your building and thinking, what is the risk of external fire spread? So there's a staged approach almost. Stage 1 is looking at the risk. They may determine it's a low risk or low likelihood of fire spread if you've got it's just constructed of brick or concrete walls, you haven't got any balconies, etc. In which case they just need to document that within your report, and that's it. You've documented it. you're all good to go. Now, if they're not sure, this is where they may make recommendation for further investigation. A basic wall assessment will then need to be carried out by a specialist fire risk assessor. And medium risk buildings where the risk is tolerable is normally falls into these basic wall assessments. They may determine that no further action is needed other than to keep the fire risk external wall survey under review. There may be some management recommendations made, just visually inspecting the fabric of your building, make sure there's no damage, etc. But the risk is deemed acceptable, you've documented it, job's done. Now, if they're not sure and they feel some further investigations needed here, then this is where the in-depth technical assessment is required by a competent, experienced fire engineer. Now, they may have the thoughts that the initial fire risk assessor got it wrong and the risk is actually low, so no further action is required. They also may find that the risk is moderate, in which case the external wall survey just needs to be kept under review. Or they may find that the external fire spread is high risk, in which case, requires some form of action to reduce the overall risk. Now, it's really important to note that the government have stressed that fire risk assessors do not need to be competent in cladding and construction materials. It's also important to note that just looking at an external wall may look like concrete, but it might be a polystyrene mix. And it's not actually the external aspects of the materials that are the higher risk. It might actually be the layers in which the cladding is built upon. So thinking of bringing into the insulation, etc. So to try and protect fire risk assessors, what the government don't want to do is for fire risk assessors, out of nervousness, just make every single building I'm not sure you're a moderate risk, go away and have specialist fire risk assessor look at it, because we've still got the resourcing issue. So they're now looking at some additional professional indemnity insurance available for fire risk assessors to protect them. So there's nothing really for you to do. It's just checking that your risk assessment now captures and references PAS 9980 in your risk assessment if your building falls under the scope of the Fire Safety Act. Okay, so moving on to the next set of regulations. These are the Fire Safety England Regulations 2022. So these came into force on the 23rd of January. So what's that, 2 weeks ago, 2.5 weeks ago? This is where the height thresholds start coming into play. But again, these are only applicable to buildings that have 2 or more residential units. Now, the Fire Safety England regulations fall into Article 24 of the IIRSM. Remember I mentioned in part 2, it was Articles 8 to 24, 8 to 23, we kind of quickly ran through. Article 24 is the power to make additional fire safety regulations when required. And that's where these have come from. And these are essentially all of the additional recommendations that Dame Judith Hackett made in her report. So for high-rise residential buildings, those buildings that have 2 or more residential units with them, but are also at least 18 metres in height, or 7 or more stories, does not include basement levels, so it's whatever's reached first, then these regulations now apply. So you need to share electronically with your local fire and rescue service information about the building's external wall system. So PAS 9980, which is quite handy, they need to have copies of that. You also need to share with your fire and rescue service details about the building. So hard copies of building floor plans and a single page orientation plan of the building. as well as the name and UK contact details of the responsible person for that building, all needs to be kept within a secure information box. Now, typically, bear in mind these regulations are only a couple of weeks old. The regulations, so in law, it's called a secure information box. Now, the fire industry has called it a premises information box. Don't know why we couldn't agree on the right terminology right from the get-go. But if you hear either of those terms used, they do mean the same thing. Now, this premises information box, it's really, really useful for the fire and rescue services because the amount of buildings that are out there that have residential aspects to them and they're unmanned. So if a fire were to occur late at night, they turn up, there's no one there to provide them with the valuable information that they need. So that's where these come into play. Now, the National Fire Chiefs Council has provided a really, really good code of practice guide on the location of the premises information box, what should be included within it, the signage, the height that they should be installed, the key that should be provided. It's free to download. You just have to go onto the government website and there's a link to it. It's really, really useful. I do have a slide next which will show you a bit of a brief idea of what these plans should look like. But your floor plans, they have said they don't want architectural drawings, just very, very simple, detailed floor plans of your building, preferably A3 and laminated so that they can review them with their kit and their gloves on. We also need to install wayfinding signage within our property. So this isn't your green directional fire escape signage. This is just signage within a protected stair, or if you've got a firefighting lobby and lift, it should be visible when those lift doors open. It's just typically to identify what floor you're on and which flats are based on that floor. Now, if you've got two corridors coming off a protected stair, then you might want arrows saying flats A to C are this way, flats 1 to 3 are this way. And then the last one for this particular height threshold is to undertake monthly checks on firefighting equipment. So this is your firefighting lifts, your evacuation lifts, and also to report any faults that cannot be rectified within 24 hours. They must be reported to your local fire and rescue service. Now, this particular regulation came about because there was a 65-year-old woman who had severe arthritis and was housed in Grenfell Tower. She couldn't negotiate steps herself and the tower had a lift available for her to use. However, the lift was out of service at the time of the fire, and so unfortunately she died on the 18th floor. So that's where this has come into play. So this I thought was really, really useful. That is what a premises information box should look like. The signage on the front, you may now notice them as you're walking around any cities, past buildings. We have already had them. It's just become a legal requirement to now have them in these buildings that fall under the scope. And then this diagram on the left, this is an example of a schematic. It was taken from the National Fire Chiefs Council code of practice that is, I mentioned earlier, free to download off the government website. And it shows how that we can document any peeps within a building without breaking any GDPR rules and regulations. So that is an example of an entire flat, building. All of those boxes are individual flats. The amber boxes demonstrate that there are individuals in there who may need assistance, but can self-evacuate. And the red boxes are those that require assistance from the fire and rescue service because they're bariatric, for example, so they cannot get out themselves. There's no personal information there, so it's a really, really good template. We've got lots of good ideas in that code of practice. This is some more details regarding those monthly checks that I was referring to. So this doesn't require the need for any third-party competent providers. But if you have firefighting lifts or evacuation lifts on a monthly basis, just need to operate the lifts. So using the key, making sure that when the fire alarm is activated, the lift's ground to service level. Check the controls, enable the lift to be taken to an upper floor. The doors open and then close from the car correctly, and then do a random check on other floors to make sure that those landing controls are disabled so no one else can call that lift from any other floors. If you've got any smoke control systems, you just need to check on a monthly basis the interface with your fire alarm and detection system to make sure they work and they operate correctly, and also doing a manual check of the fireman switch. Any dry and wet rises, it's a visual monthly check that, you know, the cabinetry isn't damaged, you've got your leather straps and padlocks in place, they haven't been tampered with. So any suppression systems, just again, visual check of control valves, make sure everything's in the right place. And if you have an evacuation alert system, again, visual inspection of the panel to make sure there's no damage or vandalism. So now we're reducing the height level. So for any buildings that have 2 or more residential units that are over 11 metres in height, then we must now inspect fire doors within the building. Now, I will show you on the next slide as to what these mean, but fire doors is always such a hot topic. I'm always asked about fire doors. What do we do? How do we know we're compliant, etc.? And people going down the routes of fire door surveys and then having quotes for repairs coming out over and in excess of £90,000. But all doors in communal areas will need to be checked on a quarterly basis. And then, so there are lift lobbies, are protected stairs, plant rooms, roof, basement, etc. And then the front doors to the flats, between the flat and the communal spaces, they need to be checked on an annual basis. And then for all other buildings, again, still with those 2 or more residential units, but regardless of height, so basically anything that falls under the scope of the Fire Safety Act, we need to be providing relevant fire safety instructions to our residents. So how to report a fire, what to do when you hit, if a fire has occurred. So if you've got a stay put policy, you need to state that. If you've got phased evacuation, you need to state that, simultaneous, etc. And also provide information on the importance of fire doors, keeping them closed. Don't tamper with removing any self-closing mechanisms. If they're changing locks on their front doors, they need to be fire rated. Don't drill holes into their flat entrance doors for a post box, etc. So this was the information regarding fire doors. I thought it was really important to share with you all. This has been taken directly from the regulations. So the quarterly checks on communal areas, it's checking their self-closing, you know, that they close on their own and they sit nicely within the frame. If you've got any cupboards or riser cupboards within the communal areas, make sure they're locked shut. And it says, open the door fully, let go, then open the door to 15 degrees, let go, making sure it's closed. Check the frames, the glazing, and the doors are all undamaged. So checking your intumescent strips and cold smoke seals haven't been peeled off. And it states in there, there's no need for any more detailed technical examination and no need to be carried out by specialists. So the responsible person or any staff acting on behalf of the responsible person should be able to do these themselves. So when you're having a property inspection, check your doors whilst you're going round. And then the flat entrance doors, which need to be done at least annually, this is the exact same check as the communal doors, confirming, you know, no alterations have been made by any of the residents. Now, a lot of people have asked, what if we can't gain access? What if our residents say no? then the regulations do state you should just record all of the steps you've taken to gain access over the course of that year. Access should be now written into any new leases. But any leaseholders not granting access, a court order can be obtained to allow for access now. So it is important that you have the right to access these front doors. So as I said, government website, all you have to do is type in Fire Safety England regulations, and they have all of these fact sheets detailed within them for each of those regulations I've just been through. Very easy to read, goes through the purpose, what they're going to do and why they're doing it, and some detail. So they are all available online with some further detail on what's expected. So moving on to the Building Safety Act. Now this piece of legislation is huge. It is enormous. So I can't go into too much detail this evening, but this reached royal assent and became an Act of Parliament in April 2022. Now it's not expected to be fully implemented until November this year. There are things that we can start to be doing to preparing ourselves, and I will go through that hopefully in this presentation just to provide some clarity. So buildings that fall into scope, again, 2 or more residential units. I know I keep repeating myself, but it is as simple as that. All of the new legislation is for buildings with 2 or more residential units. Now there is a height threshold for this legislation, and it is the 18 metres or 7 stories high, whichever is reached first. Doesn't include basement levels. Hospitals and care homes, they fall into the scope. It's if they're under construction for the time being. Halls of residence, boarding schools, they're included in the scope as well. A consultation was released last summer on what other properties fall into scope for the time being. Now this closed and the government released their decision on the 20th of December, so only a month and a half ago. And it does state they're not including prisons, hotels or military barracks within the scope of this for the time being. Now, I think this is purely because we want to focus all of our resource on those higher risk properties, which are the residential buildings that have sleeping occupation. We need to get our feet under the table first. We need to be used to it. But they have stated that they're likely to be brought into scope at a later date, so when we're up and running. With that being said, this 18 metres, the Fire and Rescue Service have been lobbying for years for a reduction to 11 metres in height. So again, we might see that being reduced in future. And who knows, if this proves to be really effective, and we've already got all of our processes in place as an organisation, what's to say this isn't going to be extended out into commercial properties as well in the next 5-10 years. I did want to include this as well. I've taken this a snippet from the government website, and this is how to determine building height. So it is from the top uppermost occupied story of a building down to the lowest part of the ground floor. So if your building's on a slant, it's at the lowest part to the footplate of the occupied story. So it doesn't include any roof plant spaces. Now we've seen lots of new roles and responsibilities. I'm pretty sure you're all aware of these ones. You've seen them all before. Client, principal designer, principal contractor, all from CDM regulations. But there now are additional legal responsibilities that have been input on these duty holders. So the main one is the accountable person. So similar to a responsible person, we've got new duty holder. So this is the organisation or the person who owns or has responsibility for the building. So this may be, you might have multiple accountable persons. Again, you may have multiple housing associations within one building. And then during a refurb, you may have principal designer in place, principal contractor, and an accountable person because of the buildings typically occupied during a refurb. Now, if the building has more than one accountable person, the organisation or the individual who is responsible for the exterior of the building and the structure of the building is known as the principal accountable person. That's really important. And the principal accountable person, although it can be an organisation, you will have to have a named individual who is that spokesperson, if you like, for the organisation. So what do their responsibilities look like? So the accountable person will have a duty to take all reasonable steps to prevent a building safety risk from happening. Now, in law, this is now defined as the spread of fire and or structural failure. And then if an incident does occur, they need to put in place suitable control measures to reduce the seriousness of that incident. So as well as your duties as an accountable person, principal accountable persons must register all existing buildings that fall into the scope of this with the building safety regulator. Now, the building safety regulator is the HSE. It is a completely separate department underneath the umbrella of the HSE, and this registration needs to occur between April this year and October 2023. Any existing buildings that fall into the scope of Building Safety Act that isn't registered by the end of October, it will be an offence. They must also prepare a safety case report and give this to the Building Safety Regulator on request and apply for a building assessment certificate from them when directed to. So the accountable person must also implement a resident engagement strategy. So it's to include a complaints procedure. It's to give the residents a bigger voice, essentially. They must share information such as the fire risk assessment findings with residents and contractors, which we should have been doing already. Maintain the golden thread of building information. I'm sure you've already heard of that term now, but in digital format, and prepare and update the building safety case. Now, there was an additional role called the Building Safety Manager, but that's now been scrapped. It was scrapped last summer and it's now been absorbed into the accountable person because it meant that the residents can be charged for the appointment of an additional Building Safety Manager. Only the Building Safety Regulator can transfer the accountable person accountability under the Building Safety Certificate. And they can actually replace them under special measures, so where they feel that they're not capable, competent, and they'll essentially just be temporarily replaced by a member of the HSE. So we've seen a number of PAS documents come out regarding competency. Competency has been a huge topic, and we're expecting much more to come. So there are a couple of PAS documents. They're easily readable, just on PDF copies, and they are for the competency frameworks of principal designer and principal contractors. Again, I said Building Safety Manager has been withdrawn. Now the HSE has requested for 2 principal designer roles, so to be split between principal designer and principal designer building regs. And the latter will then liaise with the Building Safety Regulator at the gateway approvals. So moving on to golden thread. What is it? It is essentially the term for managing certain information for the building, making sure it's easily accessible by those who need it, make sure it's up to date, and it's all of the information that we already have. I think we've all seen how easy it is for key information to be lost, especially when building changes hands. So this has essentially been designed to kind of prevent that. Now, there was a lot of talk about what this is going to look like because everything needs to be stored digitally. And it was was predicted that it was either going to go down the BIM format, so building information modelling, or down an ISO standard. But a British standard did come out. Very boring to read, so I'm not going to suggest you go through this one unless you're really struggling to sleep. But this British standard essentially goes through all of the stages of an asset life cycle, so briefing stage, design, construction, handover, asset in use, end of life, and also the intervention of the fire and rescue service. And it mentions multiple times within the standard, you don't need to go down a BIM route or the ISO standard route. It just needs to work for you and your organisation. So what sort of information should we be storing? Now, a lot of this is going to be familiar. We don't want to overcomplicate it. So when we're looking at the organisational requirements, we're looking at our fire policy, our procedures, our company standards, targets and objectives. So we're looking at our roles and responsibilities, the competency of our personnel within the organisation and who we're also appointing externally through third party. When we're looking at how we're managing our buildings, our fire strategies, our associated drawings, our construction materials, so our external wall surveys, the fire risk assessments and audit findings, trend analysis of any historical fire incidents. When we're looking at projects, so if we're looking at construction, we're looking at our competency matrix, due diligence, who we're appointing throughout the organisation, and the project stages. And also when we're sharing of information, so when a building is under construction, what fire service access and facilities are available, the schematics of fire alarm and detection systems that we have installed, as well as evidence of all of our maintenance records, frequency certifications. So we've already got all of this information. It's just a case of storing it all in one place, making sure it's digital. So here are some key points that I've kind of extracted from the standard, and a lot of them are common sense. So using standardised and consistent fire safety terms when we're filing and storing our information. So I think, well, certainly when I've been provided with electronic copies of documentation, all of the PDFs are filed in names which are all code. Cannot tell before opening it what's within that document. So saving it with suitable names rather than having fireproof, fire resistant, compartmentation, fire stopping, all of these different terms that mean very similar things. Choose a glossary or a matrix of your naming structure and make sure everything's named consistently. That means when you go and search for that information, it'll all come up. Designate responsibilities for populating the information. So when information is going to be shared or third party is going to provide you with document, fire risk assessment, fire strategy, drawings, etc. Who are they sending that to? Who is managing it? Try and avoid the duplication of information. So try and combine information where possible. Digitize everything. So if you're given anything hard copy, scan it. Develop a responsibility matrix. So who's going to be consulted, who's informed, who manages the naming structure, and also a simple workflow. So almost like a Legionella contingency procedure. Who's that information going to go to? A nice responsibility structure. So moving on to the gateway system, essentially there are 3 gateways in which a building needs to progress through from design stage to allow for occupation. Again, this is going to be managed by the Building Safety Regulator, who's the HSE, and they are the only ones who can grant progression once they are happy with the information provided in the golden thread. So Gateway 1, this is the submission to the Building Safety Regulator. So this is all the way at planning permission stage. So they need a fire statement, so the emergency arrangements for evacuation. They need to have the name of the accountable person right from the get-go. The emergency provisions available for the fire and rescue service whilst the building is being built. And also information on how the golden thread's going to be managed. Gateway 2, this is pre-construction, so construction hasn't happened yet. This is replacing the building control deposits of plan stage. So this is before building works start. So such as providing plans, proposals for compliance with building regulations, demonstrating duty holder competence as well. There are a few different approaches which I don't have time to go through today, but there is a lot of information on the HSE website, seeing as they are the building safety regulator. So if you need any more detail, I suggest you go to their website. And then moving on to Gateway 3, this is the registration of the building with the building safety regulator. So this is the end of the project. This is the declaration of compliance with building regulations. This is confirmation that the accountable person is still who they say they are. So the declaration of compliance, which is normally issued by building control, and it's also confirmation of the handover of the as-built building safety information. Now, this is essentially a statement from that accountable person to state that they have received everything. Now, this is a lengthy process, so although it does seem scary, you will be, I think we'll all be fully equipped and confident with saying that we've received everything. And then lastly is the submission of the building safety case by the accountable person. So what is the safety case? So this is your case as to how you're going to demonstrate to the building safety regulator how you manage the risk of fire spread and how you manage the structural safety of your building. So it's a document that summarises your safety case. It identifies your building's major fire and structural hazards and shows how you are managing the risks as far as you can. Once happy, the building safety regulator will issue a building safety certificate. Essentially, no certificate, you cannot occupy your building, you cannot reoccupy your building if it's been under refurb. Now, there is some guidance on the HSE website as to what the safety case report looks like. Now, they have stated, do not expect a template from them because they are not going to provide one. It is not a one size fits all. It needs to be a live document, so have version history and document control. And it's also up to the accountable person to demonstrate to the building safety regulator how you're managing your risks, not for the building safety regulator to pick holes in how you're not. So it's the other way around to what we're used to when it comes to compliance. I also wanted to touch on quickly just some other aspects of the Building Safety Act that may be of interest to you all, as you may be thinking, oh my gosh, how much is this going to cost us? Well, the government have identified that there will be a cost associated with some of the new duties, which can be passed on to leaseholders through the service charge, and these are known as building safety charges. Now, these cannot include historical remediation costs, which must be paid by developers or landlords. However, leaseholders with leases over 7 years or more in a high-rise multi-occupied building covered by this Act will be liable to pay building safety costs through the service charge. There are some statutory protections for leaseholders, so I recommend you visit the government website and familiarise yourself with a couple of fact sheets that they have provided there. And also, very hot off the press, came out last week. All developers now have been issued with a legally binding contract by the Secretary of State, Michael Gove, that they must sign in 6 weeks. Now, if they don't sign that contract, they are not allowed to work on any high-rise residential buildings. Now, this contract essentially states that they will pay for any historical remediation costs to make a building safe, and those historical remediation costs go back 30 years. So that's huge. I don't know what it's going to do to the industry. Something needed to happen. I don't think there was ever going to be a one size is going to make everyone happy. But yeah, that came out last week. And we are expecting more secondary legislation to come this year. There's another one called High Risk Buildings, Building Information Regulations 2023. They've been laid down in Parliament, so they still need to be discussed and argued between House of Lords and House of Commons. And that is essentially the high level management documentation that principal accountable person needs to have to present to the building safety regulator. So there's a lot more information coming out. And lastly, some of you on this webinar may have properties in Scotland and Northern Ireland, so just wanted to touch on whether these changes extend across the nation. As I mentioned earlier, both Scotland and Northern Ireland have their own fire safety legislation, which is very, very similar to the RFSO, which is enforceable in England and Wales. But the Garnock Court Tower block fire in 1999 resulted in Scotland improving its fire safety regulations in 2005. So they made it mandatory for builders to ensure that any external cladding inhibited fire spreading. Whereas in comparison, in 2017, there are over 450 residential buildings in England over 18 metres tall with ACM cladding. And the ACM cladding is the same cladding that Grenfell Tower had. So the most notable impact of the Act in Scotland is the introduction of the new rights of action in relation to construction products. So it now includes a clause to create new liability related to construction products. This liability will be imposed on any person who fails to comply with a construction product requirements. It's also proposing to amend Scottish law of prescription and limitation, which are essentially the time limits for raising actions. So it prevents any newly created claims from being time barred. Oh, sorry. So this is very, very similar to Northern Ireland as well, and there is a new Homes Ombudsman that is in place, which is also applicable to Northern Ireland. And also makes amendments to the Architects Act, so regarding discipline, CPD and appeal committees. So it's not directly applicable to Scotland and Northern Ireland. However, there is a big impact on it as well. So that's me. Thank you very much. That was a bit of a whirlwind, I'm sure, but I don't know if we have any questions. I think we've just got time. Yes.
We don't have any questions about your presentation of yet, which was excellent, Lauren. Somebody's asked if you would be happy to share the slides. If you don't feel comfortable doing that, that's fine, but you are happy to share them.
Absolutely fine. I'm more than happy to share slides. I will send them to you, Julie, so that you can pass them on.
Yeah, okay. I'm just making a note of the person who asked me for them. So no more questions at the moment. So if anybody'd like to ask any question, and meanwhile, I'll hand over to you, Lee, to see if you have a question for Lauren.
I don't actually have any questions for Lauren, so but I just wanted to say a big thank you, for such a great session. Really, nice explanation of those things, and I'm pretty sure that many of us will be looking forward to these further pieces of legislation and the headaches that they will cause, of that interpretation. But absolutely super presentation, Lauren, and thank you very much for sharing that information with the Northwest branch. So.
No problem. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. It's an awful lot of information. So if anyone did have any questions or wanted to contact me directly, more than happy to assist. So
great. Thank you so much for that, Lauren. it amazes me how much you managed to cover in such a short amount of time for a huge subject, but it was very coherent. And so I'd like to thank you for giving up your valuable time to do the presentation this evening. If anybody who's listening would like to volunteer for the Northwest branch, you can email me at branches@IIRSM.org and I will pass on your information to Lee. So that just leaves me to wish everyone a good evening and say thank you for attending. And we hope, oh, we just had a question in, or more like compliment. Fantastic presentation, Lauren. Thank you. Copy of the presentation would be greatly appreciated. Thank you. Yep, I'll make a note of that, John. Thank you for that. So good evening, everyone, and hope to see you at the next Northwest Branch webinar.
Thanks.
Thank you. So